today we will focus on initial contact, so where or how our horses are landing, what is happening until mid-stance phase, and then the duration of landing. So all these aspects of landing have a relevance. So you will see there's more than just looking where the horse is landing and that's it. So it's very important, the phase to mid-stance, and this is represented, for example, in the landing duration. Yeah. As Mehmet already said, breakover is the responsible phase to bring the limb into swing phase, so for limb propulsion. And then during swing phase, we have a certain movement of the limb in the flight arc or in the sideway movement, as we saw the last time. And this is, of course, influences how the limb is landing or have initial ground contact. Yeah, so we will focus on this phase, of course, but please don't see these phases isolated. So all these phases are connected to each other. Maybe we will have a webinar in one time where we can explain how these phases are connected or correlated to each other. But today, focus on initial contact and landing. Yeah. I will again start with a little practical example or case. So you see the ring of Werkman, just for the people who don't know it. I mean, maybe the attendees already saw it, but just to explain what you see, these circles just represent the hoofs. So we have the heels in the lower part of the circles. In the opposite direction, we have the toe, and then we have the lateral and medial side of the hoofs. So you see the left and the right hoof of one horse, the front feet. And you can see there's a little black line, and this line represents the movement of the hoof on the ground during stance phase. And in this case, this little red triangle you can see is the beginning of the line, and this represents initial contact. So for example, the left foot is more or less centered with the triangle, so this means we have a more or less plain landing or flat landing. And then we have the right foot with a little bit more lateral located red triangle, so this is a typical picture for a lateral wall landing, for example. Yeah. And then you see, of course, this line progresses to a kind of black rectangle, and this distance is just the stabilization of the hoof during landing. So it's not just that we look where is the first initial contact. We also see the pattern or the shape of the line until we have mid-stance phase. And then you see again these numbers in the lower part of the images. So we see in this case 10 degrees. So you can also visualize in which degrees is the hoof landing on the ground. So it's sometimes important to know not just where is it landing, but also how strong or how angled is the hoof if it touches the ground. So in this example, we see just the mare. She came for shoeing. It was a little bit over the period, so she needed to have a new shoeing for sure. She had a plain landing and a lateral wall landing, and after shoeing, we had this image. We just see little details. This is also something we will explain the next webinar. So it's not that she changed her complete landing pattern. Yeah, she still have a quite flat landing in the left foot and still a lateral wall landing in the right foot, but you see the lines, at least at the right foot, changed slightly. We will still see there's a typical pattern for each horse, but we will definitely see some influences of the shoeing, but smaller than sometimes expected. So we measured this horse sometimes because she was quite interesting, and I needed to follow up measurements for the didactical purpose. But suddenly, after 4 months, she showed a heel landing. She was not really lame. She always had the same landing as we saw, yeah, with the flat and the lateral wall landing, and all of a sudden, after 4 months, she showed a heel landing in both front feet. It was not that the owner or the vets judged this horse as lame. Yeah, it was just maybe the owner complained she was not walking so comfortable. So it was not by eye a typical lameness. But after 3 weeks, the vet diagnosed laminitis. It was a laminitic episode because the horse was injected with cortisone or glucocorticoids because of other inflammations. So it was just a reaction on this drug, and this horse developed a laminitis. And with black, it was already visible before we had some really clear signs of lameness and pain. So this is also a very important message. Usually we have quite stable or quite repetitive locomotion pattern. If you see sudden changes of the initial contact or the landing progress, we should be aware of maybe some pathologies or some problems going on. Yeah, and the interesting thing is after the laminitis healed, so after recovery 3 months later, you can see that the horse came exactly back to its own individual motion pattern after recovery. So again, the left foot had a flat or plain landing, and the right foot again the same pattern for lateral wall landing. So this is also very interesting if you have just a short period of pain, if you have an acute inflammation or lameness. This influences the gait pattern, but as soon as you can solve it very fast, yeah, you can see that the horses come back to their natural or normal landing pattern. This will be something very different if you have chronic pain for over more than maybe 3 or 6 months, or maybe over years. There, of course, you will not have such a nice outcome that horses come back to their normal gait pattern. But this example shows that we can see quite a lot in the motion pattern during landing. And the practical relevance is also interesting because we have some ideals in our head. Usually, at least in Germany, and I think in some other parts of the world, we all assume that flat landing is actually the optimal or ideal landing pattern, because if all parts of the bearing surface have simultaneous hoof ground contact, the load affecting the hoof or the joints and tendons, ligaments is more or less even distributed. So we don't have the shock just in one side of the hoof and given to the unilateral part of joints or ligaments. We have more or less a nice shock absorption, or we have a nice load and stabilization by the tendons and ligaments if the hoof lands flat. Yeah, but as we said, it's an ideal, and I try to explain today why it is so difficult for horses, or why it's sometimes very difficult for us as farriers to change the landing pattern towards a flat landing, because sometimes it's just not possible because of some factors influencing or interacting with the motion of the horse. Yeah. So in general, the definition of landing, it's actually the first part of the stance phase. So it describes the time period from initial contact until the complete stabilization of the hoof on the ground. So it's much more than just initial contact. And if you look, for example, in the image of the ring of Werkman, you see the triangle. The red one is also again in the lateral wall. So lateral wall landing of the front foot, maybe as you can see in the video. And then you see the little line until the rectangular black rectangle is instable. So you see little curves, you see it's not really going very fluent. So this is why this horse is landing on asphalt, so on firm surface with a short hoof. And then of course you see them a little bit tipping, and this is represented in this line. So this is something you would discuss as stabilization on the ground because of different properties of the hoof and also of the ground. Yeah. But we will focus first on initial contact. So it's not just interesting where the hoof lands, also the angle. I just showed it. The initial contact itself is represented in Bergman black by the image you see below. So you see this light red or red dots on the image, and this represents the area where the hoof has the most often or the most frequent initial contact during the first milliseconds. So the more red, the more contact with the ground during initial contacts. So again, this hoof has a lateral wall landing. Yes, just to explain how you can read the images. And during initial contact in literature, there are some parameters describing the progress or the development of initial contact. And this is shock. So shock is actually the peak of deceleration. So the hoof lands, and all of a sudden, of course, it's decelerated. And the peak of this maximum deceleration is the shock. Of course, during this moment, we have high forces affecting the hoof, because during deceleration, forces are transmitted or transferred to the joints and all the other bony structures. Then the shock duration is the time between the beginning of impact until zero acceleration or deceleration. And then we have the vibration. So this is the number of oscillatory accelerations. This is what I showed you in the image before. If you see little movement in the line during landing, this is because we have this vibrations, yeah, for example. And then very, very important, the impact peak. So this is the maximum peak forces during initial contact. You can see it quite good in the pressure image on the right side. You see where the initial contact starts. We have red and orange pressure peaks. So this shows very clear if you have, of course, a small surface available for weight bearing during initial contact, the load and the pressure and the forces are distributed to a smaller area than if the hoof has a flat landing and all parts of the hoof have ground contact in the same moment. The larger the surface available for force distribution, the less pressure peaks or impact peak we see. But as I said, it's sometimes not to change. So impact peak is a very important parameter as well. So shock, vibration, and impact peak describe more or less the quality of initial hoof ground contact. And there's a very nice study how different track surfaces influence or how they affect the hoofs by shock, vibration, and also impact. And I just highlighted, I would say, some relevant surfaces, for example, asphalt, sand, and rubber belts. And if you compare, for example, the properties of asphalt and sand, so if the hoof lands on asphalt, it has almost 10 times higher shock than the same hoof landing on sand, for example. And we have a lot more than the half of the vibrations more on asphalt than on sand. Sand is deformable, sand is quite soft, so there's a kind of shock absorption. That's why we have so little shock on sand, but also very high vibrations and shock on asphalt. The interesting thing is that on rubber belts, for example, we still have 4 times more shock than on sand, for example. So it's still quite high load affecting the hoof and the limb. And also the vibrations are not too small. So this is interesting because a lot of rubber belts are part of these treadmills. And good treadmills, for this reason, have a kind of shock absorbing mechanisms included just because to reduce shock and vibrations affecting the bones on the hoof, of course. Yeah, and because if we have a look on the load affecting the distal limb during initial contact, it is stated and known that shock and vibration mainly affect bones and joints. So if you have horses walking a lot or working a lot on firm surfaces, for example, these carrying horses pulling the carriage and working on the asphalt in the past, they all had a lot of problems with arthrosis and bone exostosis. And this is just because shock and vibrations due to the firm ground in the shod hoofs affect these joints and bones. Yeah, so this increased the meaning. For example, Guy knows it. He has a lot of horses working on firm surfaces in Jerusalem. Yeah, so definitely these horses have a high load due to shock and vibration affecting bones and joints. Yeah, and the second part or the second aspect of landing is the stabilization phase. So this is initial contact until zero acceleration or deceleration of the hoof on the ground. And you see the horse sliding, for example, this is also part of stabilization. So of course, we have initial contact, but then we have a phase when a lot of things happen to the hoofs. So it need to stabilize and have full ground contact. So if we have a closer look, so the stabilization is dependent on the ground conditions. Of course, it's a difference if horses walk on asphalt, so really slippery surfaces, or for example, sand or sudden stopping surfaces. For example, this modern arena beddings, they are quite fast surfaces, but they also stop the hoofs quite a lot. But it's also related to the sliding properties of the hoof. So there we as farriers come into the game. So if you can change the sliding properties of the shoe or the hoof itself, you influence definitely the progress of stabilization. So it really depends how we create the shoe, for example, or which material is the hoof protection, or how, if the nails are worn or not. So this all influences the duration of stabilization. And of course, the landing pattern is also part of this, let's say, aspect. If you have a flat landing, of course, stabilization of the hoof is faster than in horses showing a heel landing or maybe a lateral or medial wall landing. Yeah. But we will see examples. But just to continue, stabilization is also related to the hoof mechanism. So the elastic deformation of the hoof during landing is also part of stabilization. Yeah, so we have initial contact, then we have maybe a little bit sliding, or the hoof needs some time to have full ground contact. But then landing is still not finished. It's finished if you have the maximum deformation of the hoof. Yeah, so if you have, for example, the lowering of the frog or the sole arc, you have the spreading of the coronary band. So all these deformations are still part of the landing. Yeah. So if you conclude the load during stabilization, it's mainly affecting the soft tissues. So for example, the hoof cushion, or if you have the ligaments and tendons stabilizing the joints. Yeah. So it's the same if you have a hoof landing, and then during stabilization, yeah, you have some shifting, you have some tipping, you have instability. So of course, the ligaments and the tendons need a lot of activity to stabilize the joints. Yeah. So if we concluded the landing duration, now this parameter, it's represented in black with milliseconds. Yeah, it's a time period from initial contact until complete stabilization of the hoof on the ground. So it's the time needed for all parts of the hoof have ground contact. It's the time until deceleration of the hoof is completed, and it's the time until the maximum elastic deformation of the hoof is finished. Yeah. So, and this all is landing. So landing is in general the fastest motion event. It's faster than breakover. And if we compare the values of the front feet and the hind feet in walk and trot, you can see that in average, if you have a population of horses, that the front feet have a little bit faster landing duration than the hind feet. And this might be caused because in the front feet we have more variability in the landing pattern, and we see more horses with a flat landing. In the hind feet, as I will show you in a few slides, we have a dominance of heel landing. So if you have heel landing, the hoof needs more time to have full ground contact. So this would explain why we have longer landing duration in hind feet. But in general, we have a high individual variance or variation. And the landing duration itself as a parameter is just medium speed dependent. So other factors, as explained before, influence the duration of landing more than the speed of the gait. So for example, you see a horse now. So you see the front feet, the left and the right front foot in the timing table, and the landing duration on the left front is 41 milliseconds, and on the right front, just 9 milliseconds. And if you have a look how this horse is landing, you see that the hoof, which is faster, so which has a faster landing duration, has a more or less flat or plain initial contact, and the left foot with a longer landing duration has a lateral wall landing. So this is, for example, just a case where you can see that the location or the type of landing has a correlation with the duration of landing. But here's another example. Now we have the same landing pattern on the left and the right front. So both feet show a heel landing, but still we have quite a big difference between left and right front in the landing duration. And this is now this is now interesting to see, because still we have the same landing pattern, but in different angles. So both feet have a heel landing, yeah, but one feet is with a longer landing duration, has a angle of 15 degree, and the other hoof maybe has a heel landing of maybe just 4 degree. So, and this makes the difference in the timing as well. So if we concluded the landing duration is mainly correlated or strongly correlated to the angle of initial contact, also to the type of initial contact, but the angle is more important. And this is more visible in walk than in trot because of the influence of speed and increased sliding due to velocity in trot. So just to show the relevance of these parameters, I have little pony. Of course, you see it's a laminitis case. So this little pony was affected by a chronic laminitis. She had it already a few months when we saw her the first time. She had this typical laminitis gait. Yeah? And if you see her first measurement, you see she definitely has a heel landing, of course, just to protect the tip of the distal phalanx to relieve the dorsal aspect of the hoof. Before treatment, we had a heel landing. After treatment, 5 weeks later, we also still had a heel landing, but now it's worth it to use black to show the angulation of heel landing. So we see definitely over time we have a decrease of the angles. So it's just coming a little bit more smooth. So in our clinical evaluation, we would just see that the horse walks more comfortable. And in this case, black is giving us some numbers. So the angle of initial contact, in this case with heel landing, decreases with the treatment. The landing itself, the landing duration is also faster. So as a follow-up examinations, this is a very valuable parameter. So if you have such a patient and you would like to see the progress of healing, for example, you will maybe not just see sudden change of the landing pattern or the motion pattern, but you see small changes in angle and timing of the motion event, in this case landing. Yeah. So after time, if the horse becomes better and better, she maybe stay with her heel landing, but you will see that maybe the angle decreases as well, and the landing duration is also faster. And if you have a look on the landing pattern in the front feet, in the normal population of sound horses, more than 100 horses were measured. So these numbers are assessed in walk. So we see in walk that more or less 1/3 has a plain landing and 1/3 has a lateral landing. We have still some horses with 15% showing a toe landing. So this is not in general indicator for lameness or problems in the palmar hoof region. Our horses were definitely checked by orthopedic vets. They were x-rayed. We had a big examination to exclude lameness or any pathologies, and still we had 15% with toe landing. So in my opinion, toe landing is just a physiological gait pattern if you can exclude any pathologies in the palmar region. But very little horses, very little number of horses has medial landing. This is mainly correlated to this varus conformation and toed-in conformation. And heel landing is also in the front feet not that often. But in conclusion, the motion pattern in stance phase is highly repeatable and it's individual as a fingerprint. So I can definitely recognize some of my study horses over years just by looking on their individual motion pattern during stance phase. And in the hind feet, if you check the distribution of different landing patterns there, it's very, very, very often that we have a heel landing, the heel, the lateral or the medial heel or both heels. So it doesn't matter. So this is mainly the variance between the motion pattern in the hind. And how I said, this explains also why we have a longer landing duration in the hind feet than in the front feet. And the bilateral symmetry, so the symmetry between left and right, you can say it's distributed 50-50 in the population of horses. So more or less 50% of horses show a bilateral symmetry in their landing pattern. So maybe both feet land on the lateral side or on the heels or whatever. And 50% of the horses show difference between left and right feet. Yeah. This can be explained by just skewness or lateralized motor behavior in horses due to lateralized development as in the age of foals. So many reasons exist then that horses can develop asymmetrically, and this will be visible in the gait pattern as well. Yeah, so there are some factors influencing landing pattern itself. So this is how we set the ground properties and the sliding characteristics of the hoof, but also internal aspects of the properties of the hoof interact with the landing pattern, and this is mainly the body conformation, the muscle status, the proprioception, neuromuscular pathways, or motor learning and pain. So there was a very nice study in Hanover in Germany. They examined 28 horses, and tried to find a correlation between conformation and the landing. And they said there's definitely a significant correlation in the mediolateral deviation in the fetlock angle. So as you see in the image, the more the fetlock is shows a deviation to lateral or medial, the less likely it is that we have a flat landing in this horse. Yeah, and also the motion of the proximal limb during swing phase is more correlated to with the initial contact than the conformation of the toe. Yeah, this is what we already said when we talked about swing phase. So due to the body conformation and the muscle status, of course, the limb is moving in a certain way, inwards or outwards in the swing phase, and this is correlated with initial contact in each horse. Yeah, so because the locomotion is the result of the summation of all joint movements, so each joint and each conformation of each joint has an influence how the limb is moved in swing phase and also in the landing phase. And this is also interacting with slight asymmetries in the articular surfaces of the joints. We saw it already. I just explained it like for breakover and for swing phase, and I can just repeat it for landing again. If we see these small asymmetries in the joint surfaces, we will definitely have some deviation from the sagittal movement. So we will have an inwards or outwards rotation during breakover, and we will see it also in swing phase. And definitely these horses with more or less strong asymmetries in the joint surfaces will not show a flat landing. Independent what we will do with our shoeings, we cannot achieve a complete flat landing in horses. We will have an influence on landing pattern, but we will not automatically change the complete motion pattern of the horse. Yeah. This is also connected to the muscle status. So if you see, for example, horses work very unilateral, so they always bending in the same direction, the voltage horses or this carrying horse in the middle, or if you have patients with some muscle dysfunctions or tensions or pain, this definitely influences also how the hoof will land. So sometimes you have it if you trim a shoe hind foot and you just try to lift it and pull it a little bit to work on it, you can sometimes see that it's quite skew. So the hoof is, if you just lift it in statics, already not able to work in a normal sagittal plane. So if you have deviations already in stance, you definitely see it also during motion. And then, of course, we already saw that we have some receptors in the muscles. So these muscle spindle cells, they give feedback to the spine and to the cerebrum, to the brain, about the tension of the muscles. And then we have some receptors also in the joints and tendons, also giving feedback to the central nervous system. But the input of the muscle spindle cells, so of the muscular, is faster than all the other receptors, even faster than pain. So this is why the motion pattern is mainly influenced and determined by the action or activity of the muscles and not by the passive mechanoreceptors of the joints and the tendons, for example. Yeah, so still, if we shoe horses or if we trim hoofs, we expect that we change the feeling or the proprioception of the hoofs. This was at least the stated aims of some farriers. So they expect if they change the proprioception, the feeling at the hoofs, they should have an impact on the motion pattern of the hoofs themselves. So the question is, which influence has proprioception at the hoofs on the motion pattern during stance phase? So we made a little study, used 10 sound horses. So we had no black system on this moment, but we have a quite comparable output. So we see the pressure image, but still with a small little line, and the line is more or less the same as in the ring of Bergman. So we see here a horse with the left foot flat landing and the right foot lateral landing. And then we had 10 very, very sound horses. So we used the lameness locator to exclude any kind of lameness. So these horses, all of these horses were objectively sound. And then we blocked the nerves. So we had no feeling at the hoofs after we blocked the left and then the right foot. So in the images, you see the landing or the motion pattern during stance phase, at least in the lower raw, without any feeling at the hoofs. So you can see before and after anesthesia, we have no change of the individual landing and motion pattern. And this shows quite clearly that the hoof is a little bit more passive structure. So there must be other influences than the proprioception at the hoof influencing the motion pattern of horses. The horses were even not scrambling, and the variation between the strides was still not higher, so we had quite a stable, repetitive motion pattern as before. Yeah. And this is because locomotion is kind of automized. So after, let's say in the literature stated 10,000 repetitions, we have motor learning. It's called motor learning. So it's changed from a very controlled, or let's say very so we have a change from the control of the locomotion from the brain to the spine level. So it's very automized and we don't have to think about it. So for example, if you learn dancing, the first times you have really think about how to move and what to do. And after some repetitions, it's a kind of automatic movement. So then you learned a new motion pattern. And walking is the same. So in the moment the foal is born, it tries to walk. Yeah, and after a few repetitions, it's a kind of motor learning. And after a while, after 10,000 repetitions or 10,000 steps or strides, this foal don't have to think about the motion. So at least on a straight, firm ground, in a straight line, this is an automized locomotion pattern. Yeah. And this we already saw the last time in the pattern of the swing phase. The flight arc and the sideway motion is very repeatable and individual for each horse, and in the normal case, in a routine work, not really to change. And it's a little bit the same with the motion pattern during stance phase. So this is just because if the individual don't have to think about the motion, it has more capacity to react on environmental changes. Yeah, so it can adapt to new conditions, for example, in our modern world training, or it can learn new motor tasks. And you see the images of one of our study horses from 2013 to 2017. And over years, it stood more or less the same. Little changes, but in general, it has a lateral wall landing in the left foot and also in the right foot. So this is a typical motion pattern for this horse. Now is a little bit a question how develops the forces during this phase of motion. So you see the forces distributed over the time of the stance phase. So we talk about the vertical forces, so more or less the pressure or the forces affecting the limb on the hoof. So you see the line starting at 0. So we come from swing phase, so we don't have any load on the hoof. And in the moment of initial contact, you have a very steep and sudden increase of forces. So this is the blue part. So we have a peak. Yeah, and then I said we have the stabilization. So we have a little bit sliding. We have the shock absorbing mechanisms of the hoof or the ground. So this is why in the green part during stabilization, the forces decrease a little bit. And then finally coming up to mid-stance when the maximum vertical load affect the limb. Yeah. Here you see it for trot. So the first arrow is the initial impact peak. Then we have a little, very short phase of stabilization and a very long-lasting vertical load during mid-stance until the hoof breaks over and we go back to 0. The question is now how the type and the pattern of initial contact and landing is correlated to the load of the hoof during mid-stance. So the question is, if horses have a lateral load during mid-stance, if they have a lateral wall landing, for example, or if these parameters are more or less separated from each other. Let's say we can have everything, so horses can do everything. In this case, in case A, we see a horse, the left foot of a horse with a very, very clear lateral landing. And also during mid-stance, the lateral part of the hoof is more loaded. So you can see it by this black-white box here. So this just represents the location of most load during mid-stance. And then we have other cases, more often, I must say, like you also have a lateral landing, but during mid-stance, you have a more or less even force distribution. So you have an even load during maximum weight bearing. Or in other case, we have more or less a flat landing and still a shift towards one side, lateral or medial, in mid-stance. So you can conclude there's a very weak correlation between initial contact and load during mid-stance. So sometimes we really have to treat these two phases differently, or we can't accept that we can change or affect both phases in the same way. The question is, what are we doing with these horses? So what are we doing with horses which has a lateral landing and impact peak vibration and stabilization, of course, is more difficult for the limb. But during mid-stance, we have very, very even load. And this questions, as you can see here, another example, where we have an extremely medial wall landing and a very even distribution during mid-stance. And the question how to treat these horses by shoeing and trimming, and if it makes sense to force a flat landing in these horses, will be explained in the next webinar, so in December. And we will also talk about the influence of shoeing on the landing. So we definitely see some small changes, even if we don't have a complete change of the landing pattern, we definitely influence the stabilization phase of the hoof on the ground, for example, and sometimes we also increase typical motion pattern of the horse just because of the weight. Yeah, but all these aspects will be part of the next webinar where we have the influence of trimming and shoeing on landing. But for today, I think we had a quite good overview on the most relevant biomechanics of landing. And if you want, you can have some questions. And I just hope to give you some ideas what is useful to measure or what is useful to evaluate during landing. Yeah, thanks.